It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. With us here is Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine. How are things?
Very good. It's the weekend.
It's the weekend. Almost. Mark Bassett's Paris correspondent for a Spanish broadsheet of record, El País. How are things?
Good, very good. Thank you.
Thank
you for having me.
Good to hear it as well. We can go to Jerusalem. France 24 correspondent Iris Mockler is there. Jerusalem, where I understand, Iris, that embassy services are no longer available if you're an Australian citizen?
Not in Jerusalem itself, but the embassy hadn't moved, so I was going to go to Tel Aviv anyhow, and I'll continue to do that.
All right. From London, Patrick Smith, editor-in-chief of the Africa Report. What's on the cover this week, Patrick?
Greetings. Well, we're all looking at all this economic cash flowing into Africa, all these investment conferences about Africa in London, just as London's political system seems to be falling apart. So it's an interesting set of events here.
London's political system is what we'll be talking about in a moment. The World This Week, where you can listen, like, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn. The list of fine streaming services goes on. Yeah, all summer to pick a leader, and just 6 brutally short weeks for it to all go wrong.
I know that the Prime Minister takes her responsibilities to...
Mr. Speaker, I am a fighter and not a quitter.
How long can the Prime Minister last? Has she got your support? Does she have your support? Does she have the Cabinet support?
We delivered on energy bills and on cutting national insurance. And we set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
Where to begin, Patrick Smith? Maybe that line that we heard in that resignation speech about the freedoms of Brexit, which she stands by.
Yeah, I think so much of this goes back to Brexit. You now have the Conservative Party, the ruling Conservative Party in Britain, in the grip of this extreme right-wing nationalist cabal. And extreme what is really interesting about this, pretty much, yeah. I'd say that there are elements in the Conservative Party now that would be quite at home with Giorgia Meloni and Marine Le Pen, to be honest. That isn't to say there isn't a moderate wing and a slightly liberal wing of the Conservative Party, but the Conservative Party, since Brexit, has moved so sharply to the right. And I think the responsibility for that goes back to Boris Johnson, who, when he became leader of the Conservative Party, it seems like an eon ago, but it's only about 3 years ago, he purged all the centrist and all the pro-European Conservative MPs from the government and from Parliament as far as he could. So the party has moved far to the nationalist right, but they still can't seem to agree amongst themselves. And this time they seem to be fighting over personalities. That's why everyone is very skeptical that another week of leadership contestation in the Conservative Party is going to produce a leader who's certainly much better than Liz Truss or Boris Johnson. In fact, Boris Johnson has re-entered the contest and is now one of the top 3 candidates lined up to succeed Liz Truss.
We had Vivian Walt, a tweet by Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is one of those hard Brexiters. The tweet was Boris or bust.
Look, I think that, what Patrick says is quite correct. This all does go back to Brexit. And the problem is that since the whole Brexit plan was, pushed by Boris, it has been a country that has sort of been struggling to fit its reality with this kind of magical thinking that that Brexit was sold on. The fact that this was going to be better, it was going to be great, a thriving economy all on its own, and ignoring all the kind of real inbuilt weaknesses.
Okay,
and
so
perils.
what do you say, Viv, to people watching us right now from across the channel who maybe voted for Brexit and are saying, oh, these are the words of the Parisian elites who are a bit bitter about us leaving the club?
Well, so we are, but not sure about better. But obviously, it's not just for the British that this was, in my humble opinion, a terrible decision. It was for all of Europe a terrible decision. The problem was that it was based on a kind of set of facts that weren't quite real. And in the years since, they've been trying to mold the party's policies in order to kind of somehow fit those sets of facts that they sold the plan on. And it just hasn't worked. It has inherent weaknesses.
Inherent weaknesses, and that acrimony that Patrick Smith was describing is being felt by those that are more moderate. Just listen to the Conservative Member of Parliament for Broxbourne, that's north of London, explaining to the BBC why he's not running for re-election.
I've had enough. I've had enough of talentless people putting their tick in the right box, not because it's in the national interest, but because it's in their own personal interest to achieve ministerial position. And I know I speak for hundreds of backbenchers who right now are worrying for their constituents all the time, but now worrying about their own personal circumstances because there is nothing as an ex-MP.
Iris Mockler, talentless people. Is that fair to say that? And if so, how come Britain has talentless people in government?
Yes, well, that's the question, isn't it? That how did this talentless mob, this rabble, how did they take over the Conservative Party, sell them this dream or this delusion? And you can see it's a delusion because you can see all the people who voted for Brexit and had those houses in Spain and then were shocked to find that they couldn't keep living in Spain after Brexit because that's what Brexit meant, or were shocked to find that they had to stand in a visa queue to get to Europe these days because that's what Brexit meant. They had a fever dream, it seems. It's something we don't associate with the Brits because they're more calm, they're more stiff upper lip, phlegmatic, but they've flipped over Brexit, over a delusion of taking back control, whatever that meant. What we saw this week was that the markets are in control, and the market said no to Liz Truss, and that's why Liz Truss had to go. So I don't know how the Conservative Party pulls itself out of this, because I read a historian who said Liz Truss isn't a cause of this, she's a symptom, and she's a symptom of this party that's veered to the right, as we heard from London just now, veered far to the right and put talentless people in to keep the fever dream going.
Mark Bassett, your reaction to what Iris just said, because, a lot of people, middle-class people from Britain, not the rich, they bank on a retirement in Spain.
Yes, that's what was being said. I mean, that this delusion, everything, it was based on a lie, basically, Brexit. And now we see the consequences. You were mentioning that the Parisian elites or European elites were bitter, perhaps, about Brexit. But I don't think that they were bitter when Brexit happened.
That's the narrative that's being sold.
Yeah, but now perhaps they're not
papers.
bitter. They're happy. I mean, there is this German word, Schadenfreude, happy to see the pain of the others. A lot of people in Europe, in continental Europe, are saying, "We told you so." And furthermore, nobody wants to get out of Europe now. Even Giorgia Meloni, the far-right, post-fascist new Prime Minister of Italy, is a staunch pro-European, pro-NATO. The French far-right, Marine Le Pen, she's no longer against against Europe. I mean, this was like an antidote for Europeans. So I don't think that Europeans are bitter now today about Brexit and seeing what is happening these days.
Yeah, like clockwork, Truss announced her resignation just as leaders of the EU 27 were congregating on Thursday in Brussels for a summit.
I want to say that France, as a friend of the British people, hopes above all for stability in the current context, which is one of war, of tensions over energy, and a wider crisis. It is very important that the United Kingdom soon regains political stability. That's all I hope for.
Patrick Smith, just tell us what the conversation is right now. Is it just all that personality battle to replace Liz Truss and to soldier on till the next scheduled general election?
I think that's what makes this crisis in Britain so serious. Among the political watchers in Westminster, it's a battle of personalities, and we've got this three-horse race that's going to go on for the next week, and then we'll end up with a new leader of the Conservative Party and ipso facto Prime Minister. But the bigger picture is what Emmanuel Macron has just been spelling out, and the Irish Prime Minister has said as well, and I think you've had a similar message from the White House, that political instability in Britain has a cost. It has a cost within Britain, but it has a wider cost beyond the borders of Britain. You're seeing the cost to the economic well-being of the British people since we've had Liz Truss's premiership and mini budget. Interest rates have gone up by 1.5% for people borrowing money to buy houses and so forth. The cost of living, inflation has gone up more. And the worry of the European Union is that is going to go across the channel and poison the already weakening European economy faced with this existential threat of a war in Europe. So it's got very big consequences. Political instability in Britain it means a lot more than just a Westminster bubble. Unfortunately, it's not really within the political elite here in Britain. It's not really been taken that seriously. It's just another sort of leadership tussle. But I think it has bigger international implications than that.
As our partners from the Daily Beast reported, Italy is asking for a bit of respect after The Economist put a welcome to Britaly headline, where Liz Truss is portrayed as a centurion holding a pizza pie for a shield, there's a slice missing, and a forkful of spaghetti for a lance. Italy's ambassador to the UK urging the London News magazine to instead point to his country's aerospace, biotech, automotive, or pharmaceutical sectors. It would cast a more accurate spotlight on Italy, also take into account your not-so-secret admiration of our economic model. And speaking of Italy, Mark Bassett's alluded to it a moment ago. Its president asking the far-right's Giorgia Meloni to form the country's 68th government since 1946. And the irony is she's got her ducks in order compared to what's going on in the UK. She's already announced who her economy and her foreign ministers are going to be.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, it's kind of a stark contrast, really. And for those of us who watch the news, it's been kind of evident that as, you know, you have these two women leaders of two big economies in the region, one far right who seems to have it all together, and one sort of centre right, although Patrick would disagree, I think, and who has just been completely inept, let's face it. And I think the consequences are truly serious. This is the sixth biggest economy in the world. And not just that, but it is also symbolically, you know, the mother of all parliaments, as we like to say, one of the sort of founders of the entire democratic parliamentary system, and looking like the system just doesn't work.
And you heard Iris Moncler, Mark Bassett's describe Giorgia Meloni as post-fascist. This week she stared down her coalition partner Silvio Berlusconi over his blaming Volodymyr Zelensky for the war in Ukraine. It's that contrast between those two nations.
It is, and not just the contrast between the neo-fascist leader getting it all done and the democratic leader unable to to organise the most basic things in her economy, in fact, sending her economy into a nosedive. When you look at Britain today, you do have to wonder if that system somehow doesn't have to be reformed so that a general election could be pushed through at this stage when we've had 3 prime ministers in 3 years, one of them only lasting 6 weeks. And I wonder if there's any discussion, real discussion in the UK about changing that. I know that formally this government can limp on till 2024, but surely from Britain's point of view, this mess can't go on that long.
Let's turn our attention to Ukraine. Annexation claims not enough for Moscow to reverse the momentum. Vladimir Putin this week decreeing martial law for Russian-held territories there. This as pro-Kremlin authorities order the evacuation of civilians from the region around the southern city of Kherson. Mass deportations is what Kyiv is calling it. Ukrainian authorities who want independent monitors to come in to prevent the Russians from destroying the Kharkovka dam and inflicting untold damage. Ukraine, which has been on the receiving end of drone strikes targeting critical infrastructure. Iranian-made drones ever since the explosion that damaged Crimea's Kerch Strait Bridge some 2 weeks ago.
Please do not turn on unnecessary electrical equipment. Please limit use of those devices which consume most energy.
Mark Bassett, those drones are inflicting damage, but at the same time, we're getting these reports of Russia being in disarray at times on the battlefield.
Yes, and I think that in a way, the huge use of these drones is a sign of weakness. He's using Iranian drones. I mean, Iran is the country who is selling weapons to Russia. It's not China. Russia doesn't have so many allies who will give them this kind of drones. So the material he's using is Iranian, which is not very well known for being for building this kind of weapons. They are using drones. Why is Russia using drones? Because they are getting they don't have so many cruise missiles already. They use a lot of them. They don't have a huge amount of cruise missiles, and drones are really not expensive if we compare it to other kinds of weapons. So I think that the use of drones is inflicting horrible damage. The goal of Putin is to create a hell this winter in Ukraine with infrastructures, with heating, etc., etc. But this is a sign of, at the end of the day, of weakness by Putin, in my opinion.
And Iris Makler, we had the authorities in Tehran at the same time denying that they were supplying the drones and the instructors. That's the accusation from Washington. But also boasting that 22 nations have expressed interest in them. I know that Israel's defense minister had to deny that he was going to now step in and help the other side. How do Israelis feel about this all?
I think it is a game changer, or it's being perceived as a game changer here. Israel is in the lead up to an election in 10 days' time now, I think. So big decisions aren't going to be made. But when you speak to defence analysts, they say these drones were actually being developed for use in Tel Aviv. They are now being used instead in the Ukraine. And that does change things. And we have heard Israel's Prime Minister say as much, but he's a Prime Minister for 10 days more only. I think this will be something for the next government, should there be a next government and Israel isn't in this same mess, but it'll be something for the next government to consider more seriously.
The Prime Minister of gas-rich Norway accusing foreign intelligence of orchestrating drone intrusions this week. Police there on Wednesday announcing the arrest of the son of a close confidant of Vladimir Putin, accusing him of illegally flying a drone in the Arctic region. It's the 7th Russian arrested in the past few days in Norway.
One theory is that drones are being used to stoke insecurity and fear around Norway's supply of gas to Europe.
Your reaction to that, Vivian Walt?
I mean, you know, all of the north, the Baltics certainly, of course, and parts of Scandinavia are really in the front line at this point. And what's really worrying, and what Iris said, is that this war essentially is turning into a kind of proxy war of big powers, as well as really with the potential to become a much more globalized conflict.
Are we already there? I mean, we have NATO backing Ukraine.
Possibly.
Russia and Iran on the other side.
I mean, simply by the volume of weaponry that has gone in on both sides, certainly we're talking about a global conflict in terms of NATO, Iran, Russia. These are the major military powers, Russia and the US. And plus the sheer damage. When you look at Ukraine now, I mean, the amount of damage, the World Bank is now estimating $350 billion to rebuild Ukraine. That's actually an underestimate. And economists that I've interviewed months ago were predicting $500 billion. So, 40% of the electrical grid is now hit by drones. So it seems to me that this is a kind of very quickly spiraling situation.
Patrick Smith, there by the grace of God go we. I mean, you heard Iris Macher talk about a game changer. You hear Viv wondering aloud whether we're already into something that resembles a world war. I know that the UK Defense Secretary just a couple of days ago taking a step out from all the chaos at Westminster to say that a Russian missile, I don't know if it was cruise, flew past an unarmed British fighter jet in the Black Sea.
Yeah, it wasn't actually a cruise missile, and then the Russian technicians have come back and said, yeah, it was just a technical error. But no, I mean, I would concur with that. It's becoming a sort of a multi-dimensional war. It's a war of logistics. It's a war, obviously, tragically on the ground in Ukraine. It's a war of devastating physicality and kinetic damage. But beyond that, in Europe, it's testing Europe's own logistical powers, its own reserves of energy. It may get through this winter with its stored energy, but if the war drags on, and as it's likely to, in a year's time, Europe could be desperately facing a desperate shortage of energy, particularly gas. I think the one thing this war should do on the Western European side is pull us all together and stop some of the nationalistic tub thumping, particularly from Westminster, but also within the European Union. We have to see a much more unified response to this.
A more unified response. There was a 2:30 a.m. deal, and it's with a winter without Russian gas that an EU summit edged closer to a continent-wide plan on price caps and energy. This despite disagreements over current subsidies in the build-up to that deal. Listen to the German Chancellor.
The question of whether it can work at all to subsidize prices in certain areas, like in Spain and Portugal, there are many doubts. Above all, there are also many difficulties in making sure that one country doesn't end up subsidizing prices while another reaps the benefits of cheap prices.
Vivian Walt, is this return to 2007, 2008, when you had the frugal North and the Latin countries at loggerheads over what to do about the financial crisis?
I mean, this does seem a little bit different. I do recall that time. And I mean, this, in the sense, the very existential threat that Europe is facing feels quite real when you're in mainland Europe. It does feel very close, and it feels very dangerous. So I think that kind of feeling was not there during the financial crisis. It was a battle more about, rich countries versus less rich countries.
So even though they didn't have a final deal, we did see Germany bend at the summit a little, and they may get closer to one when it comes to a common energy plan.
I mean, indeed, I was just thinking, sort of watching the Chancellor, of course, he is in a position of representing a country that in some ways regarded by the rest of Europe as being to blame for the situation that Europe is now in. So
having bought all that Russian gas.
Utterly, dependent on Russian gas and putting all of Europe's in a vulnerable position. And of course, he was not Chancellor then. But nonetheless, there is such a kind of skepticism now about everything that Germany says about energy.
Yeah, on the sidelines of the summit, by the way, and you heard Olaf Scholz name-calling Spain and Portugal. Spain agreeing to scrap its long-time demand for a two-way gas pipeline through France. Instead, Pedro Sanchez, Portugal's Antonio Costa, and Emmanuel Macron agreeing on the sidelines of that summit on the construction of an underwater pipeline that will be built and operational in 4 to 5 years, says Spain's energy minister. This is interesting, Mark Bassett, because the last weeks we've seen Berlin court Madrid a lot. Olaf Scholz went to Madrid, I think, or Pedro Sanchez
went to Berlin.
That's it. Pedro Sanchez went to Berlin.
Yeah.
And now the deal is with France. Did you expect this?
Well, I expected some kind of agreement because that's how Europe works. There are big disagreements, big fights, and at the end of the day, we get something that is beneficial for everyone and nobody loses face. So Spain, as you said, wanted this pipeline that went from northeastern Spain to France and to bring gas to Germany. Germany is looking for gas everywhere. Any source of energy, they buy it. So they were supporting this pipeline. Macron, the French president, said no way. It's too costly. When it will be built, it will be too late for the present crisis, and it will damage the environment. So they found this agreement to do an underwater pipeline from Barcelona, my hometown, to Marseille, which will bring not gas, a little bit of gas, but mainly hydrogen, which is a green energy, and which is really a future energy, not an old,
And are the Spanish happy with this?
The Spanish are very happy because they think that they have succeeded in convincing Macron that Spain will be connected to Europe. Spain Spain and Portugal are isolated. The Iberian Peninsula, we have the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees still are a border, a frontier for Spain. So in energy terms, it's still an island, the Iberian Peninsula, and this will help to open this island to the rest of Europe.
Iris Makler, you hear that Vladimir Putin is doing wonders for better relations among neighbors. Didn't we just hear something about Israel and Lebanon when it comes to this?
Yes, there's a deadline, it must happen by the end of this month. And it's the signing of a deal. And it's a gas exploration deal. It's gas exploration on the Lebanese side and actually utilizing the gas that they've already found on the Israeli side. And both governments, the president in Lebanon and the prime minister here, will be out of office by the end of the month. So if they sign next week. And what that will mean is that the Israeli gas field, that the company there says that it can be online in November. That means that gas from the Mediterranean, or at least some gas from the Mediterranean, can be in Europe this winter. And I think that's been part of the American push. This deal has been negotiated for 10 years. But now, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the unavailability of gas in Europe, because of the German dependence on Russian gas, I guess, too, what we're seeing now is an agreement to get this gas from here to you as quickly as possible.
We're going to take a look at what's going to happen Saturday in Beijing, the presidium of the Chinese Communist Party Congress to rubber stamp a third term for Xi Jinping, the country's most powerful leader since Mao. In the 2-hour speech that opened the Congress last weekend, he played offense on issues like Taiwan and trade tensions with the West. And you heard earlier in the conversation, Patrick Smith, Mark Bassett saying that China careful to stay out of it when it comes to things like selling weaponry to Russia. But China's certainly assertive, and it's something that is on everyone's mind. This Congress party is a chance for a lot of people to revisit China's relations on the world stage? Will they be more insular? Will they be more expansionist? When it comes to the African continent, what's the forecast?
Well, I think the African continent, seen from Beijing, fits into the zone of countries, non-aligned countries, where they need to step up influence. I think the wolf warrior diplomacy is targeted primarily against European and US diplomats. But certainly when it comes to Africa, I think both the resources, the economic, financial resources of Africa, but also the increasing demographic power of Africa is very much in Beijing's calculations. Maybe not this year or the next, but in the next 10, 20 years, when by 2050, Africa will have 2.5 billion people living there. It will have the biggest working age population in the world. And Chinese politicians and strategists think long term. So Africa is going to become much more important in this battle for influence. But also the medium powers, places like Brazil, places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so on, are going to fit into, and Turkey are going to fit into that mold. So I think the signs that are coming from this Congress will be very much that Chinese diplomatic campaign will be very much for wooing the non-aligned powers, those between the West and the East in this. And certainly the partnership with Russia will continue despite the obvious risks of Putin's war efforts in Ukraine failing.
Is it possible, Vivian Walt, to woo foreign nations when you're shutting down at home? We've thought that the Congress would signal the end of the zero COVID policy and restrictions on travel. It doesn't sound yet like that's the case.
Not at all. And, the IMF has predicted that, has forecast that the global growth is going to be cut in half from its previous forecast, and it's blaming squarely China's zero COVID policy, which has completely thrown the global economy out of whack and disrupted supply chains and, put hundreds of millions of people under lockdowns. So it's been, and yet for Xi, this does not seem to be the major point. I mean, the major point has been sort of, you with me or against me. And that includes the COVID policy, even at the expense of economic pain. And we just had the report earlier from your correspondent about youth unemployment in China. This was supposed to be the generation that, reaped the rewards of this incredible growth in China for the last, few decades. So whether or not he can keep up this kind of social contract where, yes, you have authoritarian one-party rule, but on the rewards of that is that you have growth and upward mobility. If that starts to break down, it's very difficult to see how he can project this kind of global power.
You heard earlier in our conversation Vivian Walt saying, Mark Bassett's, how there's a bit of resentment in the EU towards Germany's purchases in the past of Russian gas. Is there going to be resentment at the start of next month when Germany's chancellor goes on a business trip to Beijing?
Well, there was already some debate among Paris and Berlin about this, because if I'm right, I think that Emmanuel Macron, France's president, would have liked to go together with Scholz. I mean, to show, make a show of unity.
But is now the time to go? Is the question.
It's not that time to go. I think that the West is divided on this issue. Europe, and particularly Emmanuel Macron, thinks that one thing is Russia, another thing is China, and Europe or the European Union should maintain good relations with China and not split the wall between the West and the rest, democracies and authoritarian regimes. Whereas the United States seems to push a line which is more in the sense of we could say, a new Cold War between the West and the rest, democracies and authoritarian regime. So I think that the European line, on this, I would say that Germany and France are completely on the same position, is to continue to have relations with China, to cultivate, because it is essential, it is considered to be essential for Europe's economy. One of the dangers now for this winter in Europe and next winter is the Chinese economy, because of precisely, as you said, Vivian, because of the COVID-0 policy and all the economic disastrous consequences that it is having for China and for the world.
Patrick Smith, there's the fear if China's economy grows too fast and takes all the energy, the fear if it starts to contract, and we don't have yet the third quarter growth figures for China. They mysteriously have delayed giving them out during this party congress. That's bad for the world as well. And then there's that other question, which is the debt trap question, which has been coming up a lot. Finances are strained the world over. China's model, the way it deals with the countries with which it builds these big infrastructure projects, is that sustainable?
Well, I mean, the debt crisis in the developing countries is getting worse. That was made clear at the IMF and World Bank summit a couple of weeks ago. I think the Chinese role in that has been somewhat exaggerated. Over 50% of the debt owed by those emerging markets regarded as being in debt distress by the bank and the fund, only 50% of that goes to official and private creditors in the West. China's debt makes up about 15%, in fact. And what you're seeing more and more is China being corralled into negotiations, often against the will of the Chinese authorities, but getting corralled into negotiations by the bank and the fund and other creditors to negotiate some settlement in that debt. But I think the real damage, I mean, apart from these unsustainable debt service commitments that so many developing countries face in general, not just from China, but the real problem is the slowdown in the Chinese economy, which is reflected in slowing demand for commodities from developing economies, particularly from Africa. And that's really reflected in lower growth figures in developing countries. We've seen this year $50 billion of investment leaving developing economies for the supposed less risky economies in Europe and the US, and that reflects this generalized slowdown. So I mean, I think the slowdown in China is certainly a domestic political risk for Xi Jinping's government, as is seen in terms of unemployment and so on. But it's also for China's relations with the developing states, and its status as a kind of locomotive for growth in those regions.
Finally, many reasons to be proud of the prodigal son of Bron, the working class suburb of France's second city, Lyon, cheering the news that at 34, Karim Benzema is European Footballer of the Year, the Ballon d'Or, the first Frenchman to win since his former coach, Zinedine Zidane. Benzema is also the oldest first-time winner since Stanley Matthews in the 1950s. Benzema led Real Madrid to Liga and Champions League titles this year. He's back in the French national squad for just ahead of the World Cup, reinstated after years of scandal and fallouts. For Benzema, it is indeed redemption.
I've gone through some pretty difficult times, like when I wasn't picked for the national team and stayed alone in Valdebebas because all my teammates were with their national teams. I think those were the most difficult moments. As I said before, Zinedine Zidane always put a lot of faith in me. That's why I'm so happy now, and really proud of my work.
If you looked at your Instagram feed after this announcement, there's a lot of pride here in France.
For sure. I mean, Benzema has been like the bad boy of football for quite a while. And it wasn't just the sort of sex tape blackmail. There was also, the whole cloud over him. Did he, was he involved with an underage prostitute, of which he was not ever found guilty, one should say. And yet this just incredible sort of image remake. It was just, it's sort of like, one did a double take. It was like, this is Karim Benzema in a tuxedo with glasses on and his kid, and, he's the clean-cut dad. And I think people were thrilled to have him back in the French squad. I mean, he's a phenomenal player. He's had an incredible year. There was that game against Paris Saint-Germain where he kind of demolished them in the most spectacular fashion. And I think people really wanted to see him. And so the timing was clearly set up as such.
Yeah. Across the Pyrenees, does Benzema have the same sort of baggage that he does here?
Well, across the Pyrenees, he's a Real Madrid player. In France, he's a French national team player. So obviously, across the Pyrenees, he's admired. He's considered one of the best players of the world, but he's not widely loved, or he doesn't represent anything more than a great player for the Real Madrid. So I'm from Barca, the Barcelona team. So for me, I don't feel this identification. But I find it interesting something that he said in the when he received the Ballon d'Or in Paris, and I'm quoting by memory, but something like, "This is the prize for le peuple." For the people, like it has some of a populist flair. This prize.
Speaking in Spanish.
Speaking in Spanish, he said that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard it in French, but
he spoke French and Spanish.
He spoke French and Spanish. Yeah. And the fact that he was saying that it was a prize for the le peuple, which in French means a lot of things and is polysemic, and you cannot understand French with le peuple.
Yeah,
the people.
It's also, there's the context of he's of Algerian origin.
Exactly.
It's a working class background, and it's an immigrant background.
Yes, and I think it's a prize, the Ballon d'Or. Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo, which were the previous great players of our era, they were machines. They were genius since they were very young. Benzema has had to be a hard-working guy. He has had his ups and downs. His story is a story of a human, all-too-human person who has had to fight a lot. So this gives a special relevance to this Ballon d'Or.
Iris Makler, redemption at age 34.
Yes, it's something we all look forward to, isn't it? I don't know as much about football, about soccer as you guys, but I do know about, I read my social media and I see that he turned up with a €500,000 watch, which was in all the stories that I read, and that Lewandowski, who was winning a different prize, he just had an ordinary Casio, €60, a bit like mine, and that the papers were making something of that. So it is redemption. He has made good, and now he has a €500,000 watch to prove it.
Okay, so Patrick Smith, Mark Bassett saying Barcelona fans see Benzema's Ballon d'Or one way. I suppose Manchester City fans must be of the same view.
Yeah, Chelsea too. He played a key role in 2 decisive hat-tricks against Chelsea and Manchester City. So yeah, I don't think they'll be overwhelmed with joy at his prize in France. But I would say that the human story of coming back after all these contretemps within France, I think, is one that others can identify with. He's had a pretty good press, I have to say, this week, and people like the idea that this guy, sort of middle-aged by international football standards, or even elderly by international football standards, has come back and won this prize after taking over from Ronaldo in such spectacular fashion.
Middle-aged,
So
aren't we all? Patrick Smith, many thanks for being with us from London. I want to thank Iris Makler in Jerusalem, Vivian Walt, Mark Bassett, and thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.